Hello, friends. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Here, I share a brand new story every day. If you enjoy my videos, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's dive into today's story. The incident occurred many years ago when I was in my early 20s and just starting to navigate the complexities of life. I had recently moved to a small, cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It was a charming place with a slightly worn out facade but a welcoming interior. My excitement at moving into my first independent space was tempered by the reality of having to park on the street, but I quickly adapted to the minor inconvenience. The neighborhood had a friendly, albeit somewhat sleepy vibe. The people were pleasant, and the local businesses, from the corner cafe to the bookstore down the street, added a quaint touch to the area. However, one particular aspect of living there soon turned into a source of growing unease. It began subtly. My car, which I parked on the street due to the lack of a dedicated parking space, was broken into one afternoon. Nothing valuable was taken, but a single rose was left on the passenger seat. It struck me as an odd and unsettling gesture. I dismissed it as a strange prank or perhaps a misguided romantic gesture from someone with a peculiar sense of humor. I resolved to be more vigilant and parked closer to the entrance whenever possible. But the incidents didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, my car was broken into repeatedly, each time a flower was left on the seat. I grew increasingly uneasy, especially when a pair of men's underwear was left on one occasion, and even more disturbingly, a bag of Tootsie Rolls, which happened to be my favorite candy, was left on another. It felt as if the intruder knew me personally, and the thought gnawed at my peace of mind. My anxiety escalated when I discovered that someone had been accessing my laundry. One day, while folding clothes in the basement laundry room, I noticed that several of my undergarments were missing. The invasion of my personal space left me shaken and deeply troubled. I began to avoid spending time at home whenever possible, opting to stay at friends' places or work late hours to escape the growing sense of dread. However, one evening, a friend came over, and while visiting, his car's tires were slashed. The timing and circumstances felt too coincidental to ignore. Then came the letter. It arrived with no return address, and the handwriting was peculiar, elegant but slightly erratic. The letter described a disturbing obsession with me, detailing how long this fixation had been going on. The writer mentioned personal observations and experiences that only someone with a close, invasive interest could know. It confirmed my fears and pushed me to take immediate action. I managed to arrange for a friend to take over my lease and move to a new place on the other side of the city. This new apartment was in a secured building with an underground parking garage accessible only to tenants, offering a much-needed sense of security. The extra money for the enhanced safety was a small price to pay for peace of mind. For a few months, things seemed quiet, but the tranquility was short-lived. My new roommate, Ashley, started dating a man named Matt. Their relationship was somewhat unconventional. They had met on MySpace, and Matt seemed to fit a certain type that made me uncomfortable. His charm was overshadowed by an unnerving demeanor. He had an unsettling way of maintaining a persistent, awkward smile, and his conversations often veered into bizarre, unrelated facts. Despite my concerns, Ashley was infatuated and blinded by her feelings. I created a dummy MySpace account to learn more about Matt, but his profile was sparse and enigmatic, offering little insight into his true self. My friends and I tried to caution Ashley about Matt, but she brushed off our concerns, becoming defensive and dismissive. The situation came to a head one evening when I came home to find Matt lounging on my couch alone, drinking a beer. Ashley was at work, and Matt had taken it upon himself to hang out in our space. Annoyed, I retreated to my room, only for Matt to knock on my door minutes later, inviting me to watch TV and get to know each other. Reluctantly, I agreed. During our time together, I tried to focus on the movie, but Matt's unsettling gaze and disconcerting smile made it nearly impossible to relax. At one point, he said something cryptic that sent a shiver down my spine. His strange behavior and persistent, intrusive smile heightened my discomfort. As the days went by, Matt's presence in our apartment became increasingly intrusive. Ashley and I grew distant as I spent less time at home, and Matt practically moved in, bringing his belongings into Ashley's room. I started to search for new housing options, but finding a suitable place took time. On their 2-month anniversary, I saw a bouquet of flowers and an open card addressed to Ashley. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to read the card. My heart sank when I saw that the handwriting matched the distinctive style of the letters from my stalker. I compared it with the old letters, and the similarities were undeniable. Matt was my stalker. I contacted the police, who took my statement and investigated. They also reached out to Ashley at work. The news shattered her, especially when she learned that Matt had vanished. He was nowhere to be found at his supposed workplace or home, and the lies he told her about his life and background unraveled. The discovery that Matt had been living a facade was devastating. When we searched through Matt's belongings, we found disturbing evidence, photos of me, including one of me sleeping, taken from afar and up close. There were also personal items of mine, underwear and a Starbucks cup with my lipstick marks. The realization that Matt had been stalking me for so long and had a collection of these unsettling items left me feeling violated and traumatized. The police never managed to track him down, and I decided to accept an overseas opportunity to escape the lingering fear. The experience had a profound impact on me. Even as I settled into a new life far from the unsettling events of the past, the trauma of being stalked remained. I lived with a heightened sense of vigilance, always wary of my surroundings. The episode also strained my friendship with Ashley, who struggled to come to terms with the reality of dating a dangerous stranger. Though we drifted apart, the shared ordeal left me with an enduring sense of paranoia. The knowledge that Matt might still be out there potentially tormenting others continues to cast a shadow over my life. The experience transformed me, leaving me with a deep-seated wariness and an aversion to social media. Even in my current life, filled with the joys of marriage and family, the fear that Matt might resurface lingers, a constant reminder of the dark chapter I endured. Many years ago, before kids, rescuing animals, a mortgage, and a husband, I was a travel writer in Europe. I did most of my trips alone. This story is about the first time I visited Lisbon. I'd never been to Lisbon, and the trip was last minute, so I had little time to prepare. A travel partner had dumped me in another country, and I was determined to make the best out of the trip by visiting a place I'd never been. Upon arrival at the train station, I visited the accommodation office and asked for a hostel not far from the center. In my early 20s, winging it was part of the fun, but these days I'm far less adventurous. The hostel they sent me to was a sprawling, crumbling, slate-gray Art Deco building on a nondescript street about a 10-minute walk to the Alfama district. The inside was probably beautiful at one time, but by the time I checked in, it was full of shabby, mismatched furniture and cheap, stained carpet. Most of the light fixtures were broken, leaving everything but the lobby dark and gloomy. It smelled of standing water and dust. I found my room, a double for $12 per night, and I made note of the fact that I had a roommate. She wasn't there, but on her side of the room was a suitcase, a dress neatly folded across the back of a plastic chair, a scattering of makeup containers on the beat-up desk, and a stack of German fashion magazines on the bed. As I had no plans or goals on this impromptu trip, I spent the afternoon exploring Rossio Square, the Baixia district, and Belém Tower. I purchased some tiles for my mom and painted eggs from a street vendor for myself. I also made reservations for a sunset dinner cruise for one. Around 6 p.m., I returned to my room to shower, change clothes, and unload my purchases. When I left my room about an hour later, there was no indication that my roommate had returned at any point during the day. After the cruise, I stopped at a tiny bar on a side street and had a glass of wine. I had heard horror stories about the dangers of Lisbon, but I felt no more trepidation than I did in any other large city. Sure, the cobblestone streets, fog rolling off the Tagus River, backlit Gothic architecture, and winding alleyways made me think of Jack the Ripper and Dracula, but in a good way. It was nearly midnight when I returned to my hostel, so I was surprised to find that my roommate still hadn't returned. That wasn't necessarily uncommon, though. Backpackers are a fickle lot. She could have gone on a short overnight trip and just left her stuff behind, maybe hooked up with a guy or girl and was holed up at their place or hanging out at another hostel. So I was surprised, but not concerned. I took another shower before bed. However, I was surprised to find that things in the room had changed upon my return. Her bed was neatly turned down, the magazines had moved to the nightstand, and the dress was gone. The strangest thing, though, was the addition of a pink silky nightgown spread across the bed, my bed. Maybe she thought she still had the room to herself? I didn't see how. My shopping bags, clothes, and toiletries were in plain view. I gently moved the nightgown over to her bed and then settled in for the night. As I wrote in my journal, I assumed she was in the shower somewhere or nearby, so I expected her return shortly. After about an hour, though, her side was still empty. I needed to use the restroom before I went to sleep, so I made one last trip down the hall. The building was unusually quiet. No regular sounds of chatty backpackers, clinking glasses, or music that would normally leak through the walls. There was nothing. It was hushed like a church after the congregation has left. I found myself practically tiptoeing back. My room was near the end of the hall, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the corridor was darker than before. The few working lights were blinking as they struggled to stay lit, and it reminded me of a funhouse. A tightness began to fill my stomach, and I subconsciously quickened my steps. There wasn't a soul behind me, yet I kept glancing back over my shoulder, convinced that I'd see someone gaining momentum on me. The only sound was the soft thud of my flip-flops as they struck my soles. I was flooded with relief as I flung open my door, but it didn't last long. Everything was exactly as it was before, except for the silky nightgown, which was now back on my bed. Sleep came in fits and starts. I left the lamp on for a while, still convinced my roommate would be right back, but the shadows it cast made the room even spookier. It was too dark with the light off. I'd finally slipped into a deep sleep when I suddenly heard the door open. A man stood in the darkened doorway, the hall light behind him showing just enough for me to see his contorted face. "I didn't mean to," he sobbed. "You have to help me." Too confused and disoriented to be scared, I sat up and scrubbed at my eyes. I reached for the lamp switch, but once the room was light, I saw that the door was closed. There was no man. I quickly bounded off the bed and went for the door. It was locked. Nobody could have entered without a key. In the hallway, it was empty. I passed the rest of the night fully clothed, sitting up in bed with the light on. Though I paid for 2 more nights, at 7 a.m., I gathered all of my stuff and went down to the reception desk to check out. "By the way," I said to the receptionist, "my roommate never returned. I'm a little concerned." She picked up the room key, looked at it hard, frowned, and then glanced at her computer. "What room were you in again?" When I repeated it to her, she looked back at her screen. "Ma'am, that room has been empty for 3 weeks, and it's been clean since then. We only have 6 people in the whole building." The hostel has since been renovated and is now a luxury hotel. Many, many years ago, long before the responsibilities of family life, I was a travel writer exploring Europe. Back then, I thrived on the freedom of solo adventures, and I eagerly embraced the unknown. This tale takes place during my first visit to Vienna. The trip was spontaneous, driven by a blend of wanderlust and the need for a break from my monotonous routine. Little did I know, this adventure would lead to one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. Vienna, with its grand architecture and rich history, was everything I had hoped for. I spent my days wandering through the opulent streets, marveling at the palaces and cathedrals, and soaking in the cultural splendor. One evening, while exploring the outskirts of the city, I stumbled upon a charming little hotel, the Imperial Haven, nestled away from the bustling center. Its quaint appearance and old-world charm were irresistible, so I decided to stay for the night. The hotel had an air of faded grandeur, with creaky wooden floors and antique furnishings that whispered of a bygone era. The proprietor, a kindly old man named Herr Schmidt, greeted me with a warm but slightly unsettling smile. He offered me a room on the top floor, saying it was the quietest and most picturesque spot in the hotel. I accepted without hesitation, eager to experience the tranquility he promised. As night fell, I settled into my room, which had a large, ornate window overlooking a serene courtyard. The view was breathtaking, with moonlight casting a silvery glow over the cobblestone paths and the distant echo of Vienna's nightlife fading into the background. I was just about to turn in when I heard a faint knock at my door. It was unusual for the hotel at this hour, and when I opened it, no one was there. A chill ran down my spine as I glanced around the empty corridor, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Returning to my room, I brushed off the incident, attributing it to my imagination. I locked the door and turned off the lights, but sleep eluded me. The silence of the hotel was almost palpable, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards from the room above. I decided to pass the time by reading a book I had brought along. Hours later, as the clock struck midnight, I heard a noise. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere in the hotel. I tried to ignore it, thinking it might be the old pipes or the wind. But then the sound grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone was moving deliberately through the corridors. Unable to bear the suspense any longer, I got up and opened my door slightly, peeking out into the dimly lit hallway. The thumping continued, accompanied by what sounded like whispered voices. I stepped out cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The corridor was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the echo of my footsteps. As I walked toward the source of the noise, I noticed an unfamiliar figure standing at the end of the hallway. He was tall, with a shadowy, indistinct form, and seemed to be just standing there, facing away from me. I called out to him, but he didn't turn. A feeling of dread washed over me. I considered retreating back to my room, but curiosity and concern for my safety urged me to investigate further. As I approached, the figure slowly turned around. His face was obscured by a dark hood, but I could see the glint of his eyes reflecting the dim light. He didn't speak, but his gaze was penetrating and unnerving. Suddenly, he stepped forward and the air grew colder. I took a step back, my mind racing. I was about to call for help when the figure simply vanished into thin air. Shaken, I rushed back to my room, locking the door behind me. My thoughts were a chaotic mix of fear and disbelief. I decided to leave the hotel at first light, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I recounted the events to Herr Schmidt, who listened with a puzzled expression but offered no explanation. I checked out and left Vienna, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. Even now, years later, the memory of that night lingers in my mind. I often wonder about the mysterious figure and the eerie events at the Imperial Haven. Was it a figment of my imagination, or was there something truly sinister lurking in the shadows of that old hotel? The experience changed me profoundly. It taught me to trust my instincts and to approach the unknown with caution. Vienna remains a beautiful city in my memories, but that night it revealed a darker side that I would never forget. In the bustling city of Bangalore, 17-year-old Ananya was hired to babysit for the prestigious Sharma family. Their residence was a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city, known for its opulent decor and grand design. Ananya, eager for the job and a little nervous, arrived at the estate just as dusk settled. She was greeted warmly by Mr. and Mrs. Sharma, who gave her a quick tour of the house, pointed out the children's rooms upstairs, and left for a night out. The mansion was both impressive and intimidating. The high ceilings and sprawling rooms feel even larger as the evening wore on. After tucking the Sharma children, Rohit, aged 6, and Meera, aged 8, into their beds, Ananya made her way downstairs. She settled into the cozy living room, where a large flat-screen TV flickered softly. The comfort of the room contrasted sharply with the eerie quiet of the house. No sooner had Ananya relaxed on the couch than the phone rang. She picked it up, expecting it to be a wrong number or a call from a friend. Instead, a man's voice, ragged and distorted with malicious laughter, came through the receiver. "Have you been up to check the children?" Ananya's heart skipped a beat. She thought it might be a prank from her friends, so she hung up, trying to dismiss the call as a joke. However, the phone rang again almost immediately. The same man's voice, dripping with sinister glee, asked, "Have you been up to check the children?" Her initial irritation turned into genuine concern. She hung up again, her hands trembling slightly. Her nerves were frayed, but she tried to focus on the TV, hoping the caller would leave her alone. But the phone rang a third time, and the man's voice was even more chilling. "I've taken care of the kids. Now I'm coming for you." Panic surged through Ananya. She was now genuinely terrified, her mind racing as she wondered what to do. Desperate, she called the local police, her voice quivering as she recounted the bizarre and frightening phone calls. The police reassured her that they would send an officer over right away, but they advised her to try to keep the caller on the line for as long as possible so they could trace the call. As the seconds ticked by, the phone rang again. Ananya answered, her voice steadier now as she pleaded with the caller. "Please, just leave me alone. I'm scared. Please stop calling." The man on the other end laughed menacingly, but stayed on the line. Ananya continued to talk, trying to distract him while the police worked to trace the call. After what felt like an eternity, the man abruptly hung up. Almost immediately, the phone rang again. This time, the voice on the other end was calm but urgent. It was the police. "Leave the house immediately. The calls are coming from inside the house." Ananya's blood ran cold. The reality of the situation crashed over her like a wave. She glanced nervously toward the staircase, her mind racing as she remembered the earlier phone calls. With her heart pounding in her chest, she bolted from the living room, sprinting to the front door. As she reached the foyer, she heard a faint creaking sound coming from the stairs. Her breath caught in her throat. The house seemed to close in around her, and every shadow appeared menacing. She fumbled with the front door lock, her hands slick with sweat. Finally, the door swung open and she dashed outside, stumbling onto the manicured lawn. Within minutes, police cars arrived, their sirens blaring and lights flashing. Officers swarmed the mansion, conducting a thorough search. Ananya stood on the front lawn, shaking and sobbing as the police investigated the house. After what felt like hours, an officer approached her. "We searched the entire house, including the upstairs. There's no sign of anyone else here. The calls were indeed coming from within the house, but there's no one inside now." Ananya was relieved, but deeply unsettled. The police reassured her that they would continue to investigate, but the experience left her shaken. Mr. and Mrs. Sharma returned home to find their house in disarray and their babysitter visibly distraught. They were horrified to learn what had transpired and thanked Ananya for her bravery. The Sharma family decided to install additional security measures in their home and offered Ananya a heartfelt apology for the traumatic experience she endured. Though the mystery of the calls was never fully solved, the incident became a chilling tale of the dangers that can lurk in the shadows, even within the confines of a seemingly safe home. As the days turned into weeks, Ananya tried to put the experience behind her, but the memory of that night continued to haunt her. She remained vigilant, always checking the security of her surroundings, and the tale of that terrifying night in the Sharma mansion became a part of local lore, a reminder of the thin line between safety and danger. In a quaint apartment in the bustling city of Pune, 7-year-old Meera was left in the care of her grandmother, Nandini, while her parents enjoyed a rare evening out at the movies. The small apartment nestled in a high-rise building was filled with a comforting warmth despite its modest size. After a simple but hearty dinner, Meera and Nandini chatted about the day's events, sharing stories and laughter. As the clock ticked closer to 10, Nandini settled into her favorite armchair, pulling out her sewing kit to work on a new project. Meera, always eager for a little independence, flicked on the TV and sank into the couch, watching her favorite cartoon. The apartment was quiet except for the gentle hum of the television and the rhythmic sound of Nandini's sewing. After a short while, Nandini felt an intense thirst. "Meera, dear," she called out, "could you please get me a glass of water? I'm parched." Meera, looking up from the TV, hesitated. "It's too dark out there," she replied, her small voice tinged with apprehension. Nandini reassured her, "Don't worry, sweetie, just follow the corridor. There's a light switch right next to the bathroom door. You'll be fine." With a sense of determination, Meera pushed herself off the couch and ventured into the dimly lit corridor. The apartment's narrow hallway was barely illuminated by a single light in the living room, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe. Mira's tiny hands followed the wall as she made her way toward the bathroom. As she reached the bathroom door, Mira fumbled along the wall, her small fingers searching for the switch. Suddenly, her hand made contact with something cold and bony. Startled, she felt the hand gripping her wrist with an unnatural strength. It was as if skeletal fingers were trying to pull her into the darkness of the bathroom. Panic surged through Mira, and with a desperate scream, she yanked her arm free and bolted down the corridor. Tears streamed down her face as she ran back to the living room, where Nandini was still seated. The sight of Mira's terrified expression and frantic cries sent a shiver down Nandini's spine. "What's wrong, dear?" Nandini asked, her voice filled with concern. Mira, trembling uncontrollably, tried to explain between sobs. "There was a bony hand in the corridor. It tried to pull me into the bathroom." Nandini's heart raced as she looked at her granddaughter's pale face. She quickly got up and checked the corridor and bathroom, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The apartment was exactly as it had been, empty and still. She tried to comfort Mira, but the little girl's fear was palpable and persistent. In the days that followed, Mira's distress only deepened. The incident left her with a profound sense of fear and anxiety. Her parents were deeply concerned and sought help from a child psychologist. Despite their best efforts, the trauma had taken a significant toll on Mira, who became increasingly withdrawn and anxious. The psychological treatment was intensive, but the incident in the corridor remained unexplained. No one could determine what had happened that night. The apartment was secure, and there were no signs of forced entry or tampering. Nandini, while heartbroken over her granddaughter's suffering, found herself haunted by the memory of Mira's terror. Rumors began to circulate among the building's residents about the strange occurrence. Some whispered about an old legend concerning a restless spirit that roamed the building, while others dismissed it as an overactive imagination fueled by the darkness of the corridor. Despite the explanations, the memory of that bony hand lingered like a shadow over the apartment. Mira's parents eventually moved to a different neighborhood, hoping to provide a fresh start for their daughter. Nandini continued to live in the apartment, though the eerie memory of that night never fully faded. To this day, the exact nature of the bony hand remains a mystery. The apartment in Pune continues to be a place where whispers of the past intertwine with the present, leaving behind an unsettling aura that few can ignore. The story of Mira's encounter with the bony hand has become a chilling tale in the building's folklore, a reminder of the inexplicable and the shadows that lurk in the corners of our lives. Several months ago, my friend Ravi and I, both eager for an adventure, decided to delve into something we had always been too scared to try: the Ouija board. We had heard countless stories about it, some thrilling, others chilling. To make the experience more compelling, we invited two other friends, Anjali and Priya, to join us. Despite their initial reluctance, they eventually agreed to participate. On the night of our séance, Ravi's living room was transformed into a makeshift ritual space. We arranged the room to enhance the mood: dim lighting, a few candles flickering softly, and an old blanket draped over the coffee table where the Ouija board was set up. Ravi, who had an interest in the occult, was especially excited, though his enthusiasm was tinged with nervousness. The board itself was a vintage piece, with intricate designs that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. As we gathered around it, the atmosphere grew tense. We placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, and with a collective deep breath, we began the session. The first few minutes were uneventful. The planchette barely moved, and our questions seemed to be met with silence. Anjali, who had been the most skeptical, grew increasingly restless. Her skepticism turned to impatience as the minutes ticked by. "This is nonsense. I'm out of here," she said abruptly, standing up and heading for the door. Her sudden departure left a strange void in the room, and Ravi suggested we should try another time. Reluctantly, we agreed. The following days were uneventful until Anjali called me, her voice trembling with fear. She recounted a disturbing encounter that had happened shortly after leaving our session. As she walked past an abandoned house near her home on the way back from the local library, she saw a little girl dressed in a tattered white dress standing in the overgrown yard. The girl's eyes were wide, and she seemed to be waiting for someone. The child asked Anjali to play with her, but Anjali, in a hurry and feeling unnerved, declined. The girl's expression suddenly changed. Her eyes filled with tears, and to Anjali's horror, the tears turned to blood. The sight was so grotesque that Anjali fled, running all the way home before calling me. At first, I thought Anjali might be overreacting or fabricating the story, but her panic was palpable, and something about the encounter felt profoundly disturbing. I couldn't ignore the connection between our Ouija session and Anjali's frightening experience. I lay awake that night, turning over the details in my mind. The image of the little girl and the bloodied tears haunted me. Despite my anxiety, I tried to push it aside, attributing it to a vivid imagination fueled by the night's events. The next day, Anjali called again, her voice filled with dread. She was going to be home alone studying and, in her agitated state, asked if I could come over to keep her company. Understanding her fear, I agreed and took a bus to her house. When I arrived, the house was eerily quiet. Anjali greeted me with a look of relief, and we settled into her study, surrounded by textbooks and scattered notes. We tried to focus on our work, but an unsettling atmosphere lingered. The silence was occasionally broken by faint creaks and groans of the old house. After a while, an inexplicable scratching noise began to emanate from the direction of Anjali's bedroom. We both froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder and more frantic. We turned to find the source of the noise and were met with a sight that froze us in terror. The little girl Anjali had described was sitting on her bed, scratching the wall with a feral intensity. Her face was contorted with an unsettling mixture of anger and sadness. Paralyzed with fear, we bolted from the room. As we reached the front door, I realized that Anjali was no longer with me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, but fear drove me to leave the house immediately. I ran outside, my heart pounding, and called Anjali's name, but there was no response. Minutes later, the police arrived at my house, their faces grave. They informed me that Anjali had been found dead, having suffered a fatal asthma attack on the stairs of her home. Her expression was described as one of sheer terror, and her body had been discovered by her family, who had returned home to find her lifeless form. The news shattered me. I spiraled into a deep state of depression and anxiety, haunted by the events of that night. I spent months in therapy, trying to come to terms with the trauma and the inexplicable connection between our Ouija session and Anjali's death. My recovery was slow, and the fear of what had happened lingered like a shadow. Recently, just as I was beginning to regain a semblance of normalcy, a new horror presented itself. A note appeared in my mailbox, written in childish handwriting. The message read, "Your friend died because she wouldn't play with me. I have a new doll." The note's appearance was unnerving, and while part of me wanted to dismiss it as a prank, perhaps a misguided attempt at humor by someone who had heard about our story, the other part of me felt a deep, gnawing dread. The note's words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the fear that the little girl might still be out there, waiting for someone else to play her twisted game. As I grapple with the possibility that I might be next, the lingering question remains, will she come for me? The fear of the unknown and the shadows of the past continue to haunt me, leaving me to wonder if there is any escape from the darkness that was unleashed that fateful night. Arjun Mehra had always enjoyed the thrill of a business trip, but his latest journey to Bangalore was different. The city's skyline glittered with modern high-rises and its streets bustled with life, but Arjun's focus was on a grand bungalow located on the city's edge. The bungalow belonged to some old friends, the Rao family, who had graciously offered him their home during his visit. The bungalow was an expansive estate with ivy-covered walls and sprawling gardens. Its grandeur was both inviting and intimidating, the kind of place that seemed to hold countless secrets within its ancient walls. Arjun arrived in the late afternoon, and after a warm welcome, he was shown to his guest room, a cozy suite with antique furniture and large windows overlooking the garden. That evening, the Rao family hosted a dinner party in the elegant dining room. Arjun, along with Mr. and Mrs. Rao and their 2 children, enjoyed a lavish meal filled with laughter and nostalgic stories. They reminisced about their college days, their careers, and the changes time had wrought. As the night deepened, the conversation turned to more personal matters, and Arjun found himself increasingly engrossed in their tales. As the hour grew late, Arjun excused himself and retired to his room. Despite the comfortable bed and the soothing lull of the night, he found himself restless. His mind replayed the evening's conversations, and a sense of unease began to settle over him. He tossed and turned, unable to escape the feeling that something was amiss. Around midnight, a sudden sound outside drew his attention. Arjun got out of bed and went to the window. The moonlight cast eerie shadows over the garden, and he saw a black hearse gliding slowly up the driveway. The vehicle's presence seemed out of place in the otherwise peaceful setting. Arjun's curiosity got the better of him. He watched as the hearse came to a stop, its engine purring softly. The driver, clad in a dark uniform, got out and moved to the back of the vehicle. The hearse's headlights illuminated the scene, and Arjun saw that there were several people inside, their faces obscured by the dim light. When the driver looked up and saw Arjun at the window, he raised a hand and, in a voice that seemed to echo through the night, called out, "There's room for one more." His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness. The words sent a shiver down Arjun's spine. Without waiting for a response, the driver climbed back into the hearse, and it slowly reversed out of the driveway, disappearing into the fog that had begun to roll in from the nearby fields. Arjun stood at the window for several minutes, trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. The encounter felt surreal, but the driver's chilling invitation was unmistakable. The next morning, Arjun recounted the strange occurrence to the Rao family during breakfast. They listened attentively, exchanging worried glances. Mrs. Rao suggested it might have been a dream, a result of the rich and heavy dinner combined with his excitement and exhaustion. Arjun agreed, though he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that clung to him. Determined to put the incident behind him, Arjun went about his business in Bangalore. He spent the day in a high-rise office building, attending meetings and presentations. The city was a whirlwind of activity, and he tried to immerse himself in work to distract from the previous night's events. As the workday ended, Arjun prepared to head back to the bungalow. He made his way to the elevator in the office building's lobby. The building's interior was sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the traditional elegance of the Rao's home. As he waited for the elevator, he noticed that it was taking longer than usual to arrive. When the doors finally opened, he was surprised to find the elevator already full, its occupants standing in eerie silence. Among them was the driver from the previous night, his presence unmistakable even in the crowded elevator. His eyes met Arjun's, and he repeated his chilling words, "There's room for one more." The other passengers, though silent, seemed to regard Arjun with a cold, distant gaze. Arjun's heart raced as he processed the situation. His fear escalated, and he knew he had to avoid this elevator. He hesitated, then quickly declined the offer, saying, "No, thank you. I'll wait for the next one." The driver's expression remained unchanged as the elevator doors closed and the elevator began its descent. Arjun stood back, feeling a growing sense of dread. Moments later, a thunderous crash reverberated through the building. The elevator plummeted, the sound of metal twisting and breaking accompanied by the screams of those trapped inside. The building's alarm system blared, and the lobby was soon filled with chaos as people rushed to the scene. Arjun's hands trembled as he watched emergency responders arrive and begin their rescue operations. The gravity of the situation sank in. The elevator had collapsed, and all the occupants inside had perished. He was shaken, but grateful for the eerie warning that had spared him from the same fate. As night fell, Arjun returned to the bungalow, his mind racing with thoughts of the day's events. He found the Rao family deeply concerned for him, having heard about the elevator accident on the news. Arjun could barely find the words to explain his experience and the eerie connection between the hearse driver and the fatal elevator ride. The following morning, Arjun decided it was time to leave Bangalore. He packed his things and said his farewells, the strange encounter with the hearse and its driver still fresh in his mind. The bungalow's grandeur now seemed to him like a silent witness to the dark events of the past few days. As he drove away, Arjun glanced back at the bungalow one last time, feeling a mix of relief and lingering unease. The memory of the driver's haunting invitation and the elevator's tragic collapse would forever be etched in his mind. He had narrowly escaped a grim fate, and the words, "There's room for one more," served as a chilling reminder of how close he had come to becoming part of a macabre reality. Meera Patel had been in a coma for over a month when the doctors finally declared her dead. Her family was devastated by the loss, and on a misty autumn morning they gathered in a serene cemetery just outside a bustling Indian city to say their final goodbyes. The cemetery was a quiet place, bordered by ancient trees whose gnarled branches whispered with the wind. As the priest recited the final prayers, Meera's husband Arun stood by the grave, clutching a garland of marigolds in trembling hands. "May she always rest in peace," he whispered, placing the garland on the coffin before it was lowered into the earth. But peace was not what Meera found. That night, as a heavy fog settled over the city, a man dressed in dark clothes slipped into the cemetery. He was well prepared, carrying a shovel, a flashlight, and a small leather pouch filled with tools. This was not his first time disturbing the dead. His name was Ravi, a notorious grave robber who had grown bold with each successful heist. The recent burials were always his targets, and Meera's funeral that morning had not gone unnoticed. Ravi had heard rumors about the wealthy Patel family and the valuable jewelry Meera had been buried with. The emerald ring, in particular, had caught his attention, a family heirloom said to be worth a fortune. He found the fresh grave easily and began digging. The earth was still loose, making his work quick. As he dug, the only sound was the rhythmic scrape of the shovel and the occasional rustle of leaves. Finally, Ravi reached the coffin. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and then pried it open with a crowbar. Inside, Meera lay as though asleep, her hands gently folded over her chest. As expected, the rings glinted in the dim light of the flashlight. One a diamond wedding ring, the other a large emerald set in gold. Ravi knelt beside the coffin and tried to slide the rings off, but they wouldn't budge. The cold had stiffened Meera's fingers, making it impossible to remove them. Frustrated, he pulled out a small knife from his pouch, intending to cut the rings free. But as he positioned the blade, something unexpected happened. Meera's fingers twitched. Startled, Ravi froze. He told himself it was just a muscle reflex, something common in the recently deceased. But then it happened again. This time, Meera's whole hand seemed to move. Panic set in, but greed outweighed his fear. He needed those rings. Ignoring his rising terror, he pressed the knife against Meera's finger. Suddenly, Meera's eyes snapped open. Ravi gasped and stumbled backward, dropping the knife into the coffin. Meera's chest heaved as she took a deep, rattling breath. Her eyes, wide with confusion and fear, stared directly at Ravi. Before he could react, she sat up, her movements slow and jerky, like a puppet being pulled by unseen strings. In his panic, Ravi knocked over the flashlight, and the cemetery was plunged into darkness. His heart pounded in his chest as he heard the sound of fabric rustling. Meera was moving inside the coffin. With trembling hands, Ravi fumbled for his flashlight, but in the thick darkness, it was impossible to find. Suddenly, Meera's voice broke the silence. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone soft but filled with a strange, otherworldly quality. Ravi's breath caught in his throat. The reality of the situation became too much to bear. In his terror, he scrambled to his feet, abandoning his tools, and ran as fast as he could. But in his frantic state, Ravi lost all sense of direction. He dashed between the gravestones, his mind clouded with fear, and he found himself running deeper into the cemetery instead of out of it. He could still hear Meera behind him, her footsteps slow but deliberate, as though she was calmly following him. Desperate, Ravi made a sharp turn, hoping to find the gate, but instead he tripped over a loose stone and fell hard into an open grave. He landed with a thud. The wind knocked out of him and lay there, dazed and disoriented. The grave was deep, the walls steep and slick with moisture, and as he tried to climb out, his feet slipped on the muddy earth. Above him, the fog swirled and parted as Meera appeared at the edge of the grave, peering down at him. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her shroud billowed around her like ghostly wings. Ravi's terror turned to desperation. "Please," he begged, "let me go." But Meera said nothing. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. In his frantic struggle, Ravi dislodged a loose stone from the grave wall, sending it tumbling down. It struck him on the head, knocking him unconscious. When he awoke, it was morning. The fog had lifted, and the cemetery was bathed in the soft light of dawn. Ravi found himself lying at the bottom of the grave, the stone that had knocked him out beside him. There was no sign of Mira, but the open coffin nearby was empty. Weak and disoriented, Ravi managed to pull himself out of the grave. His body ached, and his mind was a whirlwind of confusion. The tools he had brought were scattered around the grave, forgotten in his terror. He limped out of the cemetery, vowing never to return. As for Mira, she was found wandering the streets later that day, still dressed in her burial shroud. She had no memory of what had happened in the grave or how she had come to be alive again. All she knew was that she wanted to go home. The grave robber Ravi was never seen again. Some say he fled the city, too frightened to face the consequences of his actions. Others believe that the cemetery claimed him that night, swallowing him whole in its shadowy embrace. But one thing was certain: Mira's rings remained on her fingers, a symbol of her strange and miraculous return to life. One autumn afternoon, an elderly man entered a library, showing a card with his name on it, Mr. Richard Wallace, and asked if he could borrow a book. "The name of the book I want is The Ancient Manuscript. It's number 41567, I believe," he said. "But I don't know this library at all. Would someone be able to go and find it for me?" A young man who worked there, Mr. Harris, was passing, and he answered, "Of course, I'll go and find it for you immediately, sir." Mr. Wallace sat down on a chair near the door to wait. When Mr. Harris returned, he had to apologize for failing to find the book. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Wallace, but someone has already borrowed that book." "Are you sure?" replied Mr. Wallace. "Yes, sir," said Harris. "But if you wait a moment, you'll probably meet the man who has taken it as he leaves the library. I didn't see him very well, but I think he was an elderly man, quite short, wearing a gray coat." "It's all right," said Mr. Wallace. "I won't wait now. Thank you. I have to go. But I'll come back again tomorrow, and perhaps you can find out who has the book." "Of course," replied Harris, and Wallace left the library quickly. Harris thought, "I'll just go back to that room and see if I can find the old man. I'll ask him if he can wait a few days for the book, and then I'll give it to Mr. Wallace tomorrow." So he went back to the same room, and when he got there, the book, the ancient manuscript, was back in the right place. Harris felt very bad. "Mr. Wallace hasn't got the book he wants," he said to himself, "because I didn't see it. I'll wait for him tomorrow and give him the book myself." The next morning, he was waiting for Mr. Wallace. "I'm very sorry," he said when Wallace came in, "but I was sure that the old man took the book away with him. If you'll wait for a moment, I'll run and get it for you now." Again, Wallace sat down and waited, but this time his wait was very long. After 20 minutes, he asked the woman behind the front desk if it was very far to the part of the library where Harris was looking for the book. "No, not far at all, sir," she answered. "It's odd that he's taking such a long time," and she went to look for Harris. She came back a few minutes later, looking rather worried. "I'm very sorry, sir, but something has happened to Mr. Harris," she said. "He suddenly became ill while he was looking for your book, and we have had to send him home." Mr. Wallace was surprised, but he answered politely, "I'm so sorry that Mr. Harris became ill while he was trying to help me. I'd very much like to go to his house to ask how he is. Could you give me his address?" The woman gave him the address, and before he left, Wallace asked her one last question. "Did you see an elderly man in a gray coat leaving the library soon after I was here yesterday afternoon?" "No, I didn't," replied the woman. "There were only 2 or 3 other men in here yesterday afternoon, and they were all quite young, I think." Mr. Wallace then left for Mr. Harris's house. He found him in a chair by the fire, looking pale and ill. "I'm so sorry for all the trouble I have caused you," Harris said. "Don't worry about it," said Wallace. "But what happened in that room? Did you fall? Did you see something?" "Well, yes, I did fall, and it was because I saw something," answered Harris. "It was just as I went into the room where we keep that book you want." "No, no," said Wallace hurriedly. "Don't tell me now. You will make yourself ill again." "But I'd like to tell someone," answered Harris. "Not now, young man, not now," said Wallace, standing up quickly. "I'm afraid I must go now," and he moved towards the door. Harris gave him the exact number of the book, the ancient manuscript, so that he could go to the library and find it himself the next day. But Wallace did not appear at the library again. Harris had another visitor later that day, Thomas Blake, who worked with him. Thomas said, "I'm sure there is something odd going on at the library, you know. When we found you on the floor, there was a terrible, strong smell in that room. It can't be good for people to work with a smell like that." Harris replied, "That smell isn't always there. I've only noticed it during the last few days. And it wasn't the smell that made me ill. It was something I saw. Let me tell you about it. I went into that room this morning to get a book for a man who was waiting downstairs, a Mr. Wallace. The afternoon before, I saw a short old man in gray take the same book out. But when I looked again, the book was there, back in its place. So this morning I went back to get it for Mr. Wallace, but the same old man in gray was there again. I looked more closely at him this time and saw that his skin was dry and brown and dusty. He had no hair at all. Horrible he was, really ugly. He was reading a book near the one I wanted, and when he turned around, I saw his face, and he had no eyes. It was a terrible shock. Everything suddenly seemed to go black inside my head, and I fell. I can't tell you anything more." Before Harris returned to work, his boss at the library told him to take a week off, go away somewhere, and get some fresh air to try to forget his experience. So he went to the station carrying his luggage and waited for a train to Greyport. As the train arrived, only one car seemed to have any places in it, but as he walked towards it, the head of the old man with no eyes suddenly appeared again at the window of the train. Harris felt sick. He ran to the next car and jumped into it just as the train started to move. The next thing he knew was that a woman and her daughter were kindly helping him to sit down. They seemed rather worried about him. Mrs. Carter and her daughter were also traveling to Greyport. They had an apartment there, and during the journey they invited Harris to stay with them. They soon became friends and spent a lot of time together. On the third evening of his stay, when Harris was telling them about his work at the library, the daughter suggested that Harris might be able to help them with a problem they had. "Yes," said her mother. "We'll tell Mr. Harris our story, and perhaps he'll be able to help us." "I'll certainly try," answered Harris. "Well," began Mrs. Carter, "I had an old uncle called Dr. Baker, and when he died, he left directions that we should put his body in a special underground room under a field near his house, and that he should wear his ordinary clothes. Since then, many of the country people around there say that they have seen him in his old gray coat. Anyway, he's been dead for 20 years now. He had no wife or family, just me, his niece, and my cousin Robert. He had a lot of money and a big house, and Robert and I hoped to receive half each when he died. But the day before he died, I was sitting near his bed when he suddenly opened his eyes and said, 'Alice, I've left everything to Robert in my will, you know. You won't get anything when I die.' This was a shock to me because my husband and I were not rich and we needed the money. But I said nothing because I felt that he wanted to say something more. I was right. He continued, 'But Alice, I don't like Robert and I think my will is wrong. I've decided that you should have everything, but first, you'll have to find the letter in which I have written my new will. And I'm not going to tell you where it is, but I will tell you one thing. I've left it in a book, Alice, and the book is not in this house. It's in a place where Robert can go and find it any time. So I'll tell you something more that Robert doesn't know. When I'm dead, you'll find an envelope in my desk with your name on it, and inside it you'll find something that will help you.' Well, a few hours later, he died, and I wrote to my cousin, Robert Wallace, but of course, he has never replied. Meanwhile, we have to continue living in our small apartment here at Greyport." "Did you say Robert Wallace?" asked Harris, amazed. "I saw a man called Robert Wallace just a few days ago, a thin, elderly man." "Yes, that sounds like him." "Where did you see him?" asked Mrs. Carter. "In a public place," said Harris. "I don't know if I should tell you where, but what about the envelope?" "Here it is," answered Mrs. Carter, and she took out a small piece of paper with just 5 numbers on it, 15567. Harris thought for a moment and then said, "Do you know what this number is?" "No," answered Mrs. Carter. "It's the number of a book," said Harris, "and I'll get it for you if you can be patient for just a little longer." The next day, Harris returned to the library and borrowed the ancient manuscript with the number 41567 on it. The book had been in that room for years and was very dusty. He turned it over in his hands, and as he did so, a piece of paper fell out of it. It was the letter which Dr. Baker had written, leaving all his money to his niece, Mrs. Carter. In September of the year 1811, a little boy arrived at the door of Mithla Mansion in the middle of Garbara. He rang the bell and looked around him at the tall, square, 18th century house. An evening light fell on the building, making the windows shine like fires. In front of the mansion, there was a park full of trees and a temple with a clock. It all seemed very pleasant to the boy as he waited for someone to open the door. The boy's parents were dead, and his elderly cousin, Mr. Narang, warned him to go and live at Mithla. People who knew Mr. Narang were surprised at his offer because they thought he was a man who loved books more than people and preferred to live alone. Mr. Narang opened the door and seemed very happy to see his young cousin, Ravi Kapoor. He immediately started to ask questions. "How old are you? My boy, how are you? And how old are you? I mean, I hope you are not too tired to eat your supper." "No, thank you, sir," said Ravi. "I am quite well." "Good," said Mr. Narang. "And how old are you, my boy?" It seemed strange that he asked the question twice in the first 2 minutes of their conversation. "I'm 12 years old next birthday," said Ravi. "And when is your birthday, my dear boy? 11th of September, eh?" "That's good. That's very good. I like to write these things down in my book. Are you sure you will be 12? "Yes, sir. Quite sure." "Well, take him to Mrs. Joshi's room, Sharma," Mr. Narang said to his servant, "and let him have his supper." Mrs. Joshi was the friendliest person at Mithla. Ravi felt comfortable with her, and they became good friends in a quarter of an hour. She was 55 years old and knew everything about the house and its neighborhood. She was quite willing to share this information with Ravi, and there were certainly many things about Mithla Mansion and gardens that the boy wanted to ask her. One November evening, Ravi was sitting by the fire in Mrs. Joshi's room, thinking about his new home. "Is Mr. Narang a good man?" he suddenly asked. "Good? My child," said Mrs. Joshi. "He's the kindest man I've ever known. Haven't I told you about the little boy he brought here from the street 7 years ago, and the little girl 2 years after I started working here?" "No, please tell me about them, Mrs. Joshi," said Ravi. "Well," she began, "I don't remember much about the little girl. Mr. Narang brought her back from his walk one day and told Mrs. Desai to take care of her. The poor child had no family. She lived with us for about 3 weeks, and then one morning she got up while everyone was still asleep and left the house. I've never seen her again. Mr. Narang looked everywhere, but she never came back. She was a very silent child, but she helped me a lot, and I loved her very much." "And what about the little boy?" asked Ravi. "Ah, that poor boy," said Mrs. Joshi. "He came here one winter day playing his music, and Mr. Narang asked him lots of questions, such as, 'Where do you come from? How old are you? Where are your family?' He was very kind to the boy, but the same thing happened. He just disappeared. That night, Ravi had a strange dream. Near his bedroom at the top of the house, there was an old bathroom, which nobody used. The top of the door was made of glass, and it was possible to look in and see the bath. In his dream, Ravi looked through the glass and saw a body in the bath, a very thin, dusty body with a sad smile and the hands pressed over the heart. As Ravi looked, a terrible cry came from the lips, and the arms began to move. Ravi was extremely frightened and woke up suddenly. He found that he really was standing on the cold floor near the bathroom. Bravely, he looked through the glass again to see if the body was really there. It was not. He went back to bed. When they heard about Ravi's experience, Mrs. Joshi and Mr. Narang were very interested, and Mrs. Joshi put a new curtain over the glass door of the bathroom. Mr. Narang said he would write about Ravi's dream in his book. It was nearly spring when 2 more strange things happened. The first was that Ravi passed another very uneasy night, and the next day he saw Mrs. Joshi mending his nightshirt. She seemed rather angry with him and asked, "How did you manage to tear your nightshirt so badly? It'll take me a long time to mend it." Ravi looked and saw that there were some cuts in the shirt, a few inches long. "I don't remember how it happened," he said. "I don't remember anything." but they're just the same as the scratches on the outside of my bedroom door." Mrs. Joshi looked at him, her mouth open, and then ran upstairs to see. "Well," she said when she returned, "it's very strange. I wonder how those scratches appeared. They're too high for a dog, a cat, or a rat to make. Don't say anything to Mr. Narang, but remember to lock your door when you go to bed tonight." "Oh, I always do," replied Ravi. The next evening, the second strange thing happened. Mr. Sharma, the servant, visited Ravi and Mrs. Joshi in Mrs. Joshi's room. He did not often come to see them there. When he came in, he didn't at first notice that Ravi was there. He seemed very nervous and uneasy. "Mr. Narang will have to get his own wine if he wants a drink in the evenings," he said. "If I can't go down and get it in the daytime, I won't go at all. There's something very strange down there under the house. You know, maybe it's the wind or maybe it's rats, but I don't think so, and I don't like it." "Don't talk like that," answered Mrs. Joshi. "You'll frighten young Ravi." Mr. Sharma suddenly noticed Ravi for the first time and quickly said with a nervous laugh, "Oh, I was only joking, you know." But Ravi knew that it wasn't a joke, and he was worried. He asked a lot of questions, but Mr. Sharma refused to tell him any more about the noises under the house. It was now March 24th, 1812, a strange day, windy and noisy. Ravi stood in the garden and felt as if it was full of ghosts, people he couldn't see who were flying in the wind and trying to contact living people in the real world. After lunch that day, Mr. Narang said, "Ravi, my boy, will you come to my library late tonight at 11 o'clock? I will be busy until then, but I want to show you something about your future life. Don't tell Mrs. Rai, Joshi, or anyone else in the house. Just go to your room at the usual time." Ravi was excited. He could sit up until 11 o'clock. He looked in at the library door when he was on his way upstairs that evening, and he saw on the table a silver cup filled with red wine and an old piece of paper with words on it. At about 10 o'clock, Ravi was standing at the open window of his bedroom, looking out over the nighttime countryside. The wind was not so strong now, and there was a full moon. Suddenly he heard some strange cries. Perhaps someone lost in the night, he thought, or water birds down on the lake in the park. The noises grew louder and came nearer the house. Then they stopped. But just as Ravi was about to close his window and continue reading his book, he saw two children standing outside under the dark trees, a boy and a girl. They stood together, looking up at his window. The girl reminded him of the girl in his dream about the bath, and the sight of the boy made him feel afraid. The girl was smiling, holding her hands over her heart. The boy, with his untidy black hair and old clothes, stretched his hands out helplessly in front of him. His fingernails were very long and dirty. As the boy stood there, with his arms held out, Ravi suddenly saw something which made his hair stand on end. He could not believe his eyes. There, on the left side of the boy's chest, was a large black hole. Again, Ravi heard the children's terrible, sad cries. Then they disappeared. Although he was badly frightened, Ravi decided to go to Mr. Narang's library. It was now nearly 11 o'clock. He walked very fast through the dark old house, quiet at this time with all the servants in bed. But when he arrived at the library, the door would not open. It was not locked, and the key was on the outside, but when he knocked, there was no answer. He listened carefully, and he heard Mr. Narang speaking, no, crying out. But why? Perhaps he too could see the strange children. Then suddenly everything was quiet, and the library door opened by itself. Mr. Narang was in his chair, his head thrown back and his eyes wide, with a look of terrible fear and pain on his face. On the left side of his chest was a large hole, and Ravi could see his heart. But there was no blood on his hands, and the long knife on the table was completely clean. The window of the library was open, and the wind blew the curtains in a terrible dance. An old book was open on the table, and this is what Ravi read. Thousands of years ago, people discovered that you could control the world, fly, disappear, or become someone or something else, all by magic. But to be able to use this magic, it is necessary first to take out the hearts of 3 young people under 21 years of age. I have spent almost 20 years carefully choosing 3 young people who I could kill without anybody noticing. First was Rina Verma on March 24th, 1791. Second was an Italian boy, Giovanni Paoli, on March 23rd, 1805. And tonight, on March 24th, 1812, the last child to die for me will be my cousin, Ravi Kapoor. No one will ever find the bodies of these children. I have hidden the first two in my wine cellar under the floor, and I will do the same with the third child tonight. The ghosts of these children may come back, the books tell me, crying horribly. They may try to take the heart of the man who killed them, but this will not happen to me, I am sure. Ravi finished reading and looked at the body of his elderly cousin. Quietly, he left the room and closed the door. For many years, people wondered about Mr. Narang's death. It must have been a wild animal that came in through the open window and killed the poor man, they said. But Ravi knew the truth. I was staying with a good friend of mine in the South Coast. I arrived on Friday night, and my friend was keen to show me the village on Saturday morning. I'll take you around and show you everything. Then I want you to meet a friend of mine, Rahul Kumar. He's about 70 years old and knows all the history of the village. Oh, and make sure you ask him about Kumar's Pond. Why? Is it a good place for fishing? I asked. He laughed. Well, no. There's no water in it now, but let old Rahul tell you the story. I'm sure you'll enjoy it, said my friend. The next day, after a tour of the village, we went to old Rahul Kumar's house for tea. We persuaded the old man to tell us the story of the pond. It was the Diwali of 1683, and a young gentleman, Rohan Kumar, returned from Delhi University to the village. He was a popular young man and used to ride his horse long distances to visit his friends in the neighborhood. One night it was raining hard, so instead of riding all the way to his house outside the village, he decided to stay at the small guest house here. As it was Diwali, there was music and dancing in the guest house, and all the young men and women were dancing together, except one. Her name was Priya Singh, and she worked at the guest house. She was an innocent young girl, not very intelligent. In fact, people used to laugh at her behind her back, and of course, none of the young men wanted to dance with her. But Rohan Kumar, the young gentleman, took pity on her and asked her to dance. The band was playing an old song called Mabuba, Will You Walk, Will You Talk With Me? Everyone saw how happy the poor girl was to have someone to dance with. Her face lit up with a smile. After that night, the young gentleman came to the guest house every week. When he arrived on his horse, he used to sing that song, and Priya Singh used to rush out to meet him as soon as she heard it. The two often went for walks together by the pond, and some people say they saw them kiss. This went on for a few months until Rohan Kumar's parents found a wife for him. She was a beautiful, rich young woman and from a very good family. Everyone said how lucky Rohan Kumar was, but then it all went wrong. The young woman heard about Priya Singh and was angry that a gentleman like him went about with an ordinary village girl. She refused to marry him. He, of course, regretted ever meeting Priya and was very angry to lose such a beautiful young wife. People say that the next time he saw Priya, they argued, and he hit her. A week later, they were seen together again. He said a few words to her and then rode off. They say she looked very happy all that day, but not long after, she disappeared completely. No one could find her anywhere. Some weeks later, Rohan Kumar came into the guest house again, went into the bar and asked for a drink. A young woman called Anita, a friend of Priya Singh's, served him. "Are you looking for Priya, sir?" she asked. "Because no one has seen her for weeks." He answered angrily that, no, he was not looking for her and sat alone, drinking his tea. Anita started to wash some glasses and without thinking began to sing the song, Mabuba, Will You Walk? Will You Talk With Me? The young gentleman's face turned pale and he told her to stop singing immediately. She stopped immediately, of course, but then suddenly she heard Priya's voice outside the door, continuing the song. "It's Priya! She's back!" Anita cried and ran towards the door. "Stop!" shouted Rohan Kumar, but it was too late. The door opened, and a strong, cold wind blew out all the lamps, leaving the room completely dark. Anita heard someone walk across the floor, and the door of the big cupboard opened and shut. When she lit the lamps again, she saw something that looked like the bottom of a woman's dress caught under the cupboard door. Anita was frightened and asked one of the men in the bar to open the cupboard, As the man pulled open the cupboard door, Rohan Kumar screamed and ran out of the bar into the street. Out of the cupboard came a small human shape, dressed in clothes that looked wet. No one saw its face, but everyone felt a freezing wind as it passed through the bar and into the darkness outside. The next person to see Rohan Kumar was a young boy who was coming home from fishing at the pond. He said he saw the young gentleman running towards the water, looking very frightened. He broke a branch off a tree and started to feel around in the water with it. After some minutes, the branch hit something, and a strange sound like a scream came from deep in the pond. Rohan Kumar covered his ears with his hands and started to scream also. As he did, the boy saw a human shape come out of the water and chase the young gentleman away into the trees. The boy ran and called the police. They found the body of Priya Singh at the bottom of the pond, and under a tree was Rohan Kumar's knife covered in blood. He was guilty of murder, of course, and they hanged him 5 weeks later. After that, everyone knew it as Kumar's Pond, although it's dry now. And you know, said old Rahul, that even now no one will sing that song in this village. People say it's unlucky. My home has an unair-conditioned basement that we use primarily for washing clothes, keeping the dogs, and storage. When it's not too hot or cold outside, I will go down there sometimes at night to do group chats with friends after my wife and kids have gone to sleep. One evening, while down there, an old Operation board game started making one of the noises over and over again. This was a version that had a funny sound for each of the organs to remove. It initially scared the crap out of me, but afterwards I laughed about it, and the guys on my group chat heard it and laughed too. It would do this randomly every so often for months at a time, using different sounds each time, over and over. I assumed it was just the old board game slowly dying. My family all heard it as well. Later, we began finding evidence of a rodent in our basement. I caught glimpses of it out of the corner of my eye and assumed, because of its size, speed, and ability to climb rapidly, that it was a squirrel, as we'd had them in the attic. It did a good deal of hidden damage, especially chewing up books or other research material, and we began to find nests all over the garage. We tried various means to get rid of it, including a variety of traps, poison, and a sound emitter. Nothing worked. We eventually saw the culprit, which turned out to be a very large rat, but we could never catch it. It was able to climb vertically as fast as a squirrel, much faster than a rat should have been able to. It seemed to be abnormally intelligent, like rats of NIMH, intelligent. It would get the bait from the traps without triggering them and wouldn't eat the poison blocks. I put all the poison blocks in the rafters and ductwork to prevent the dogs from getting them. However, at some point, the rat pushed one of the blocks onto the floor where one of our dogs found it, and we had to quickly take him to the veterinarian to induce vomiting and ensure he was okay. He made a full recovery. During this same time frame, when I opened the basement door and turned on the lights, I would notice a shadow in the shape of a person at the bottom of the stairs, just for an instant before vanishing. Not always, but sometimes I could turn the lights off and on again, and it would not reappear. I assumed it was some weird electrical issue. My daughter finally encountered the rat in the basement and killed it with her softball bat. I got rid of it and cleaned out the basement, and we thought that was the end of it. Only another rat showed up in the next week or two and continued the damage and continued to elude death or capture. Eventually, I started to think outside the box, as I had never really put any of the three phenomena, the rats, the shadow, and the operation noises together, but realized they had all occurred during the same time frame. I noticed that my old Ouija board was directly beneath the operation game. I had not used it since high school. I researched Ouija boards and discovered that you are supposed to close sessions by moving the pointer to goodbye and not to store the pointer on the board. I had never done that, although the board had not been used in more than 20 years, and I had never had any real encounters with it, just pushed it around to scare the other teenagers. That evening, when I went home, I took it down and opened the box, and sure enough, I had left the pointer on the board, which I reckon left the connection open for all those years, until something found it and used it. I quickly moved the pointer to goodbye, asking any presence to leave and not return, and said a prayer. I then stored the pointer in the box, separated from the board. A few days later, we found the dying rat in a drawer, poisoned, and after cleaning the basement out again, have had no further rodent problems. The shadow stopped appearing at the bottom of the basement stairs as well, and the operation game stopped making noises. I don't have any concrete evidence or real answers, but my hypothesis is that something found its way through the open Ouija board and somehow managed to manipulate the board game, the rats, and manifest as the shadow at the bottom of the stairs. Our home has been saged, and I grow sage in our basement as well now. I have also done enough research to be able to respond if anything happens again. So this started a few years ago at my old job at a pizza place. I don't have a great memory, so this won't be a fluent story, more like disorganized highlights. It began not long after we started working there. Stuff was being thrown, things went missing, but I didn't think much of it until I noticed the footprints. Bare footprints through the left side of the kitchen, coming from the fryer, through the storage area, and to the drive-through window. Now, I'm a logical person, and we had a person with schizophrenia working with us, so I debated the possibility of it being him with my boyfriend, who also worked there. We even compared feet to the footprints. None of us matched. They were about size 10.5, and over time they would slowly disappear. I don't know why, but while I was working there, I felt that the ghost's name was Filbert. I don't think I'm psychic, but I could be sensitive to the paranormal, as anytime I thought of the ghost, I thought of Filbert. A few other things happened, like glass fogging in the drive-thru at odd times and a window being broken from the inside one night after closing. I personally found it fascinating, but it scared my boyfriend because I don't believe in ghosts. Well, he does now. Anyway, after a while, I started talking to it, asking it questions, or requesting it to do things. One time, we were all goofing around, and T asked about the ghost. I said, "Filbert, if you're here, move this sign." I pointed to it. It was a map of the surrounding delivery area. We watched it for about 20 seconds, and as we were about to give up, it started to move. Not a small amount either. My boyfriend pointed out that there was an air vent next to it, so that didn't prove anything, but I didn't hear the air come on. As time went by, it just became part of normal life. Things got thrown, and we'd just say, "Be quiet, Filbert." I didn't feel anything malicious from it. It just seemed like it wanted attention to be seen and heard. So I made a decision one night that I may come to regret, but I don't as of yet. I invited it home with us. I told it that if it was lonely at the store, it could follow us home. By the time we closed, I'd forgotten about it. I was sitting next to the side door, waiting in my car for my boyfriend to finish up. As I was sitting there, I heard a metallic clunk, like someone pulling and letting go of the door handle, then rustling in the back seat. I immediately remembered what I'd said, and although I did mean it, I didn't think it would actually follow us home. I told my boyfriend about it when he got to the car. I don't remember the conversation we had, but soon after that, we started having experiences at home. Electronics would turn on by themselves, and we'd constantly lose things. Items on the bed would just disappear. No footprints, but I put that down to not having constantly greasy tiles like in the store. I remember once I asked Filbert to turn on the PlayStation for me. I know PlayStations can turn themselves on sometimes, like my boyfriend pointed out when it did turn on seconds later. That's when I noticed a controller on. It was about 5 feet from me and 3 feet from my boyfriend on a clothes pile against a wall. I said it wasn't the PlayStation. He used the controller to turn it on. And I pointed over at it. Another time, we were just sitting around watching TV. We have these soup cans that we put cigarette butts and ashes in. It was sitting in front of me, and suddenly, with a thump, it flipped over onto its head like someone flicked the bottom of it. I asked, "Did you see that?" "Yup." Thinking about it, it could have been a spring in the mattress, but I find that unlikely since we have a very thick memory foam layer. Eventually, I got so used to it, I forgot about it. Not completely, just didn't think about it all the time anymore. I stopped talking to it. It recently crossed my mind to post my story as it's gotten different lately. The last few weeks, my boyfriend and I have been getting random scratches, and I tend to get headaches every night around midnight. I don't find it scary or even threatening. I think it just got tired of not getting any attention. We're currently in the process of moving, so I'm kind of waiting to see if it follows us to the new house. I just recently came across this website and I love it. I've always believed in the paranormal. I think it's because my mother was so fascinated by the paranormal and true crime. I wouldn't call myself a psychic, but I have had dreams that have come true and gut feelings that were correct. This is a story about my mother and my father. My mother passed away unexpectedly in 2006, and it was such a devastating experience for our entire family, especially for my father. The day my mother passed away was the day my father lost the sparkle in his eyes. My father always enjoyed working outside, vegetable gardens, greenhouses, working on his antique car, etc. One weekend, my husband, now ex-husband, and I moved, and during that move, I managed to catch the flu. On our first night in our new home, my father came over around 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. while I was in bed sleeping. My husband woke me up and said, "Your dad is here, and he wants to see you." He knew I had the flu, but it was unusual for my father to show up unannounced, especially after dark. He had poor night vision. I got out of bed and went into the living room to see my father to make sure he was okay. Back then, 2009, when we all had interchangeable phones, I had several of them. I'd buy a new phone, and the old one would be placed in our cell phone collection. My father told me he had been working in the yard and had his phone in the front pocket of his shirt. When he bent over to pick some weeds, his cell phone fell into a bucket of water. I asked him if he had taken the SIM card out and soaked both the SIM card and the phone in rice. He said he had, but it was too soon for the phone to dry, or it might never dry, making it useless. He asked if I could get one of my phones and put his SIM card in it so he would have a phone. He had disconnected his landline shortly after my mother died. I was feeling so ill with the flu, and since we had just moved and I had no idea where our cell phone collection box was, I told him that he would be fine for one night without a phone, and I would get him another phone first thing in the morning. He agreed, saying, "I can go one night without a phone." I gave him an air hug, since I was contagious, told him I loved him, and went back to bed while he went home. About 6 hours later, around 1 a.m., I was woken by my mother's voice. I was not dreaming, so I didn't see her, but I heard her voice saying, "Get your father a phone." I thought it might have been a dream, or that my high fever and medications were causing it, so I disregarded it. About 2 minutes later, I heard her voice again, this time louder and more demanding. "Get your father a phone." I sat up in bed so fast that it woke my husband. I got out of bed looking for the box of cell phones. My husband asked why I was looking for a phone when I had said I would get him a new one the following morning. I didn't tell my husband about my mother's demands, fearing he would think I was crazy. I found 3 phones that I knew would work with my father's SIM card. I got in my car, and my husband insisted on coming with me. I'm not sure why. I unlocked my father's front door. He was sound asleep in the recliner in his living room. He woke when he heard his front door open and me saying, "Hey, Dad." He was curious about why I was there so late and why I was bringing a phone when I had promised to get him one the next morning. I didn't tell him about my mother either. I just said I didn't feel comfortable knowing he didn't have a phone, especially in case of an emergency. Anyway, I got one of the phones working with his SIM card and plugged it in to charge. Around 3:30 a.m., my father called me and said, "Julie, I'm not feeling so well. I woke up vomiting and have a bit of pain in my lower abdomen." When my father says he has a little pain, it usually means he's in extreme pain. He had a high tolerance for pain. I got him to the hospital within 30 minutes, and within 2 hours of being at the ER, they admitted him. His intestines had twisted and he was throwing up bile. He was just a few hours away from becoming septic. My mother, from the grave, saved my father's life that night. I finally told him about my mother's urgent demand that I get him a phone immediately. When I told him, he cried, and he was not a man who cried much. I just wanted to share this with everyone. It's not a haunting or anything scary, and I wouldn't classify it as paranormal, but it was my mother coming to me to save my father's life. Before I lived where I do now, I used to live in a neighborhood in the suburbs of Georgia, specifically in Maplewood on Elm Street. The house was not particularly old and had been built around 1963. From what I remember, there weren't many other kids in the neighborhood. It was mostly older residents. My grandparents on my father's side lived about three houses down on the opposite side of the street. I was probably about 5 years old, maybe a bit older, but definitely no more than 7.5 because that's when we moved. The house had an addition called the playroom downstairs that my younger brother and I were never fond of going into alone, especially at night. It had a creepy feeling, but nothing ever happened in that room. I have always considered myself a practical person, even as a child, but what I am about to say is absolutely true based on my experience. It only happened once, but it was terrifying. One night, it must have been during the summer, I was lying in my bed, hot, uncomfortable, and unable to sleep. I don't remember the exact time, but it was quite late. I remember getting up and going into my parents' room, climbing into their bed where a ceiling fan was on. I got between my father's and mother's legs and was lying on my back. At the bottom of the bed, there was a footboard, a thick post that ran across the bottom slightly above the mattress. This is where I had often propped my feet up or pressed my foot against it. I was lying in the bed for what seemed like a while. The ceiling fan above me was on, and I was aware of my surroundings, still restless. The two pull strings on the fan used to adjust the speed and turn on the fan light were clicking together. I remember just staring at their movements, thinking to myself, I wish they would stop clicking. Not long after, I heard a noise at the foot of the bed. I looked down and saw a shadow cat gnawing on the post, seemingly trying to get at my foot. This figure was as clear as the nose on my face. I remember the glowing eyes. I was so terrified that I lost my breath and had to consciously take a breath to scream. I let out a blood-curdling scream that woke both parents. Frantically, I climbed back up toward the headboard, staying between my parents, keeping my eye on the shadow cat. My mother started screaming, and my dad shot out of bed, turning on the lamp on his nightstand. The second the light came on, the figure vanished instantly. My parents were shaken by the sudden awakening, and I was crying, terrified of what I had witnessed. I explained what I saw, and my mother and I stayed in bed with me clinging to her like glue. My father cautiously checked around but found nothing. It took some convincing, but I was shown that there was nothing there. To this day, my parents chalk it up to a nightmare, but I was absolutely awake and told them so. This experience was so vivid and terrifying that it has been hard to forget even 30 plus years later. I still can't explain exactly what it was because it looked and sounded like a living, breathing shadow cat, but the fact that it vanished the way it did, with no trace, has me completely stumped. The doors and windows were all shut. Nothing was in the room when I left my room and went into theirs. This thing was there one moment and gone the next. Longer than 5 seconds. I absolutely don't have any other explanation besides paranormal, but I never saw it again, and nothing has appeared in my life since. I'm now 36 as I write this. There was an uneasy feeling whenever my brother and I were alone, but I think that was just being really young and afraid of the dark, as kids usually are. I don't spook easily. As a kid, I loved scary things like amusement park haunted houses. I would even position myself at the bottom of my bed so I could look into my parents' bedroom via the reflection of the mirror to watch late-night TV. Tales from the Crypt fascinated me but never scared me, so I don't think that has anything to do with it. I was old enough to discern a nightmare from reality, and I'm convinced it was not that. I will add a few additional notes and details. Before I was born, or when I was very young, my grandmother would have one of her best friends over to her house, the one down the street, and hold seances using Ouija boards. I'm repeating what I was told, but from what I remember, the stories go like this. They asked the spirit if it was good or bad, and it responded, bad. Evidently, this spooked them enough that they stopped doing it. For the longest time, those Ouija boards, 2 of them, a smaller one, and the standard one everyone knows, ended up in the bottom of our kitchen pantry, leaning against the wall. I remember once or twice getting them out and spelling my name and various words, learning my ABCs and numbers when I was really young, maybe 3 or 4. These were eventually thrown out or sold in a garage sale. But nothing strange ever happened in the kitchen or pantry, nor with the boards themselves, at least not around me that I know of. But that's the only thing I can think of, though it's an afterthought. I also have Cherokee heritage. Though it's so far removed, I doubt it has anything to do with this. I have more Frankish descent from my mother's side of the family. Speaking of parents, my mother has a protective personality and tries to calm everyone and have them get along. My father has always had little patience and a quick, fiery temper. My younger brother has a follower personality. I have a creative and inquisitive personality, but very grounded, I like to think. Anyway, I've always wondered what exactly I saw because last time I checked, shadow cats don't just turn up in bedrooms and vanish when the light turns on. I'm curious if anyone has had a similar experience or could shed some light on this event. I've listed everything I could think of that might have a possible link or connection, but I'm more curious than anything. This is the one event in my life I can't practically explain. I saw what I saw, and this is how I saw it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.